What if the way we use our imagination actually impacts our everyday 3D world?
What a question. That's what we're going to explore. My name is Will Wilkinson.
I'm Christopher Harding. This is Thriving in Business and Life, and we're going to really dive into the whole idea of imagination and vision first and look at how does it impact our real everyday world. Now, Will, I know you're a believer that it does. You've experimented with this for years. You coach people in this idea that how we use vision and imagining actually impacts how things happen.
Well, I've gone through a metamorphosis over the years. It's true that I've worked with this a lot. It's been a field of study for me and also practice in my own life with clients. A lot of exploration, you could say, in one way or another, which has really matured my understanding. And I say that guardedly because it suggests that I understand it. I'd say it's a evolving understanding. The short answer is yes, and I think we've got time to explore what my longer answer would be.
So there might be some qualifiers, is what you're saying, or some, you maybe could say nuances to it.
Well, I think the fundamental one is that we tend to operate with a disconnection between what we call imagination and what we call reality. Mm-hmm. So we'll assume that this three-dimensional world, my car, my job, my wife, the table in my office, this computer, this microphone I'm speaking into, are what we would call real.
Right.
And that my daydreaming, my imagining, my thinking of my father asking me if I'd like to split a beer with him 20 years ago is just some kind of nebulous, formless, what we call imagination. So I think that's a good place to start, the disconnect between those two, that one is much more real than the other.
Right. So if I hear you right, you're saying there's this separation between what we call tangible reality, things I can touch and knock on and feel, and that we can measure with our as some people call them, puny instruments. And we say that things that can be felt and measured are real, and things that are, quote, imagined are just daydreams or things in our head.
Yeah, it relates to really questioning the nature of awareness in relationship to reality. I mean, if I'm not suggesting you do this, but if you knocked me over the head and I passed out, everything that I think of as real would be gone. I'd be unconscious.
Right.
So really then reality depends on awareness. But as we know from our work in our Thriving course, awareness is very much influenced by our own way of looking at things. So our awareness is not really of the way things are. Our awareness is of the way we believe they are. And we're all telling different stories.
Right. So, for starters, our perception of reality is varied depending on our perspective.
Yeah.
What filter am I wearing? What lens am I looking through would be metaphors that we could use to describe that. And so one way to look at our imagination or the vision that we might hold in our mind as a goal is that we are starting to filter reality to align with a type of vision or goal. So we start looking for evidence to lead us to that place. That'd be one way to look at it.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. And I wanted to begin this conversation today on this cautionary note, because I think it's easy when we study things that aren't, readily understood, to look for a simple answer. For instance, our topic today really is, does imaginary visioning affect the real world?
Right.
And that gets into setting intentions and having goals and writing them down and so forth. It's easy to look for a simple answer. In this case, it would be yes or no.
Right.
And then we might say, well, yes, qualified by, are you good at doing it?
Okay, right? Sure.
So then there's skills. But others might say, well, you can't get the conscious mind too involved because the greater creating ability resides in the subconscious and unconscious minds. So that's a whole other conversation. So I just wanted to kind of drive a wedge into the tendency to get into simplistic thinking on this, because it isn't. It's very nuanced. You use that word. I agree. It's a very complex subject.
Well, so in trying to break this down, let's start playing with an example. Let's say that I have a goal that I'm getting ready to go out of town. I'm going to attend a series of meetings. I want to envision those meetings going really well, that the outcome of those meetings is highly productive for everybody involved. And so I'm envisioning that. I'm imagining it, you could say.
Right.
One of the things we talk about a lot is I'm feeling what it's going to feel like afterward. I'm driving back home and I'm feeling, wow, those meetings went so well. Everybody seemed to get a real lot of rich value out of those meetings. So I'm in a way you could say I'm pre-programming my unconscious, right? And by doing that, I'm going to influence the outcome to a certain degree because I'm going in with an intention. If I follow our method, I'm going to walk in there and say, well, who do I need to be in order to create the highest likelihood that that's going to happen? So my imagination is used in league with my intention and how I show up. Right. So it's not just I imagined it and I completely set it aside.
You've got precise. Yeah, and I think one way of describing what you're doing, and I do the same thing with good results, is you're setting your filters. Right. Your perceptual filters. It's not that much different from what a pilot does on the runway when he does his pre-check. He's just checking that everything's working fine, and his intention is to fly and land safely. So your intention in the example you used is to have a successful event.
Right.
Well, you're just checking all the things that would influence having a successful event, just as the pilot checks all the things that are going to affect having a successful flight. So you set your filters, and because your intention is to have a successful, enjoyable event, your filters will begin helping you select information that contributes to that result. So there's 3 or 4 people talking over here. You're going to be drawn to the conversation that supports your intention. You'll really just filter out the other ones because they don't support what you've intended to do.
Yeah, so part of it is and the filters are largely unconscious.
Mostly unconscious. We don't really understand we're doing that, but we all do all the time.
Well, and the more you talked about practice and skill level and so on, the more we practice doing something like this where I imagine, we call it, backcasting. You put yourself into the future and you reflect back on something as if it had already happened. What we're talking about is we're setting up unconscious filters. We're creating real clear conscious intentions. I'm really starting to, you talked about the plane, in this metaphor, maybe I'm the plane. I'm saying, how am I going to behave to create the best chance of going there? So a pilot who's flying from Chicago to San Francisco probably won't fly to New York first, then Houston, then San Francisco.
Right.
Not a real direct route, right?
Yeah.
So I start becoming aware, both consciously and unconsciously, of how am I showing up and what's the effect it's having? Is the effect that my behavior is having actually producing the result that I imagined taking place?
Well, you're bringing up a very, very good comparison using the metaphor of flying, because anyone who's flown, particularly in the cockpit, knows that you're course correcting all the time.
Right.
And this is something that's often ignored when it gets into whether or not creating a detailed intention about results works or not. Usually, again, the simplistic argument is yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. But part of the reason it works is because of course correction. You don't just say, I'm going to LA and that's it. You don't just say, I'm going to have a successful meeting and that's it. You course correct. You get into the meeting. You notice this happening. The lighting isn't right. The mic isn't working correctly. Because the intention is to have a successful meeting, you're now more aware of what it will take to accomplish that. It's not really so magical after all, because there are many details that will conspire together to get that result. Being aware of them because you've set your filters for this result, you begin to attend to them, adjusting here and there.
Well, yeah, that's really good. I love the course correction kind of metaphor because, and this is sometimes where a lot of times people will get so detailed about their goal or their vision that it becomes rigid. Yeah. And therefore they're not able to course correct because they're locked into the rigidity of this very specific way they thought it should happen rather than the result.
Yeah, and the phrase for that, which we're all familiar with, is get it done.
Right.
Just get it done. We need to hit our numbers, or we need to achieve this goal. Any way you can do it is fine. Don't tell me about it. Don't tell me the details. Now, that's a pretty predatory approach, but often that's in there when our allegiance is to accomplishing some particular goal that we've envisioned that may or may not actually be appropriate.
Well, and I guess the question we were talking about values last week is my vision, is what I'm imagining, the goal I'm setting in alignment with my deeper values, those things that really light me up. If it is, then, and it seems like another part of the equation is to focus, and we really think about this in the way we do this, but to focus not only on the tangible result, did I meet the sales goal, for example, or not, but how did I meet it? What was the quality of experience I created while doing that?
Yeah, I had a pretty dramatic example of this the other day. I intervened in a local dispute with a friend and someone, all of whom shall remain nameless. And the one party was going for what they wanted, and they were in dispute, in conflict. And he was, using his lawyers to get what he wanted. And there were a lot of underlying details, including some health challenges, and this situation was getting more and more stressful. And I contemplated, is there any way I can help in this situation? So finally I sent an email to this person who was kind of hard charging towards a goal that he wanted, and I said, I'd like you to just consider the effect of what's going on here and ask you a question. Would you be willing to consider prioritizing a different result, namely to increase love? And I had no idea what the response would be because this individual is quite litigious, has a history of this. This seemed like a very kind of warm and fuzzy kumbaya sort of idea. But I sent it off, and right away, within a few hours, I got a response back. Wow, I get that. I have done that in the past. That has been a value of mine. Thank you for reminding me, and I'm going to adjust what I'm doing.
Interesting. Yeah, so just by introducing a quality as well as a quantity, you could say, into the equation, it helped people realize that nothing we do is without effect.
Well, and in this case, I reminded this person of a value that was important to them that had been temporarily eclipsed by a goal that they'd manufactured they wanted to achieve, involving money and proving they were right. So I think that's something we do as friends for each other, is to remind each other, if we notice someone has seemingly lost sight of a value that we assume or know they have, to just gently remind them.
Yeah. Well, that's great favor, and it sounds like they were open and responsive.
They thanked me.
Yeah.
I was worried that this would be an imposition. They'd think I was being a control freak, or putting my nose in where it wasn't any of my business, because it really wasn't. But I think the way I did it was disarming.
Yeah. Well, you just asked a question. Again, we've talked about that sometimes. Just asking a question allows somebody to consider another possibility. So if we think about what our question was at the beginning, does our imagination actually impact our 3D world? we've talked about a lot of practical ways that our imagination, through the use of our unconscious, through the creation of unconscious filters, by setting intentions, by it governing our behavior, it's starting to have all these very practical, pragmatic impacts. And I hope people listening can go, yeah, I can see how that makes sense. So the other question, and there may not be any definitive answer to this, but it's kind of a curiosity of mine, is there something else at play? In other words, if we kind of try to tap into the idea of quantum physics and the observer effect, that what we focus our attention on actually changes things at a molecular level, is it possible that how we focus our energy on things not only guides our behavior and sets up all these things we just described, but that it is actually changing the material world at an atomic or subatomic level?
Well, we're kind of going deep here during this program. And I hope our listeners are enjoying the hike.
Getting off into the weeds here.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think, again, we can reframe the way we use the term imagination. I'd like to just suggest that we consider, it's I don't think going to hurt us to consider for a few minutes, that actually what we call the real world lives in our imagination. They're not separate. And that we're really imagining this into being, and we can imagine something different. I think all of us have had tangible examples of this. We imagine that somebody doesn't like us,
right?
Let's say. And then we finally talk to them, we find out that we made it up.
Right.
So this was part of our reality. Oh, she doesn't like me. Well, it originated with a funny look over dinner 5 years ago. They were constipated. There was something completely different going on, which we used our imagination to create as part of what we consider our reality. This is a person that doesn't like me. We just made it up. My question is this happening far more widely than we have assumed, so that in fact our quote-unquote reality actually exists within our imagination?
Well, that's a great question. And just to go to the very specific example you gave, as we talk about stories, the challenge with our imagining things like that, creating a story in our head about somebody doesn't like me, is I then begin looking for evidence to confirm that.
Yeah, and you can prove it.
Right,
yeah.
And so I have confirmation bias. I've filtered through reality to give all the possible evidence for that. And so now it's even harder for me to consider the possibility that isn't true.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to consider that our imagination has become congealed. And anything we can do to free it up is good. I remember a quote I used in one of my books from Alice in Wonderland, where the Queen was talking to Alice about doing things, and Alice said, well, that's impossible. And the Queen said, well, I dare say you think it's impossible because you don't practice enough. I do. I imagine 6 impossible things every day before breakfast. And in this book, I advise people do that. They just deliberately daydream about impossible things, because everything that is possible at one point was considered impossible, like breaking the 4-minute mile.
Right.
Impossible, can't be done. One person did it, and then a whole bunch of other people could do it immediately all over the world. Why was that? I propose because imagination had congealed into a law. This is the way it is, until somebody disputed that and just broke through it. Other people then could follow along.
Well, there's a quote in a book by Richard Bach, who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull. This is from another book, but basically what he says is, argue for limitations and they're yours.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah, and it's kind of goes to your point. If I imagine that something's impossible, for me it becomes impossible.
Well, and you use the term limitations, and so let's raise the specter of what I consider the greatest limitation, which is in the way we view our life as a closed system. In science, there's a whole series of laws which only work in an assumed closed system.
So give an example of a closed system. What would be a closed system? The human body, I guess, maybe would be considered largely.
Yeah, I mean, a good example is every day my wife and I, most days, take a walk in the forest. We live in the forest. So the example of a closed system would be I am walking along in my body and I am separate from nature.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, so I'm a closed system.
Right.
However, the reality is that my body is filled with trillions of cells
right.
and microbes and intelligence that is interacting with the environment, the trees, the soil, whatever is in the air. And actually, that is an imaginary distinction. Now, my body is enclosed within my clothing, so there is something distinct. But actually, the line is far more blurred than we think.
Right. So that closed system thinking, we could say, is where we create boundaries and regulations that, they're useful. They help us function in day-to-day life, but it's the confusion between an intentionally closed system where we've closed it for order or convenience or protection, and then becoming convinced that the artificial boundary we set is actually real and therefore creates a real boundary.
Yeah, I mean, an example inside the body is we have a liver.
Right.
And we have a gallbladder. Well, they're not separate. I mean, they interact with each other, as do all the organs. Now, it's convenient to say that here's the liver and here's the gallbladder. But actually, in operational terms, the line between them is not that distinct. They're interacting.
Right. Well, so as we look at this in our day-to-day life, and we start to think about, well, so it sounds like learning how to use the imagination and getting practiced at the very least, is going to create some good subconscious programming, set up some good filters, allow us to have more intention, to increase the likelihood of a goal or a vision we may set. And there's this other possibility that's more difficult to measure, that one, we're interacting with life all the time far more deeply than we might think, but also, gosh, maybe we are actually at some kind of a atomic level or molecular level having an influence on the way electrons interact.
Well, and again, the default is usually polarization. So either I'll believe that or I won't.
Right.
Either it's all intuition or it's all logic.
Right.
Well, there's a reason we have both of them. We need both of them. I want to be very practical. When I get in my car, turn on the ignition, I head out onto a road, which is a dangerous place to be. Thousands of tons of metal hurtling past me. I want to be extremely practical. I don't want to be daydreaming about the quantum field while I'm driving. Unless I'm a passenger, I could be doing that. But here's an example, and I think we're kind of zeroing in on an important distinction when it relates to using our imagination, creating intentions, having goals. Does it or doesn't it affect the real world? And I think the distinction is another question. Am I undertaking this as my own science project, or am I participating in a field of intention? Now that's a big question. Here's an example. Some weeks back now, and this will date the program, the Masters golf tournament was on.
Right.
And Tiger Woods was playing, and there was some question, as has been for a number of years, whether this would be his comeback. Well, as this tournament began, I happened to read a news article that some guy somewhere was betting on Tiger Woods to win. He thought he would win the Masters. Now, the odds of him winning were pretty remote because he hadn't been playing that well. When I read that, I had a very strong intuition that he would.
Right, so it resonated with you.
It totally resonated. I just felt this was true. It wasn't logical. It was intuitive. And I, of course, proceeded to ignore it.
Rather than place a bet.
I did not place a bet. Now, this guy in this news article, and some of our listeners may have read about him, he and his wife placed their life savings.
Oh, my goodness.
They had saved for years, and they put it all on the table, betting that Tiger would win. And he did win, and I think their reward was $1.2 million.
Now, we're not recommending this,
No,
mind you.
Absolutely not. And my point in bringing it up is that you could just say, all right, well, you can explain that away.
They got lucky.
They got lucky, and, I follow golf a little bit, and I thought, well, maybe he could win. I'm telling you, it was something deeper than that. I feel that I was tapping into an awareness that I ignored. And I think the value in considering this is, again, to raise a question. Are we all equipped with an antenna, or a lot of them, to perceive things beyond the logic of our lives that maybe if we develop that capacity, we would be able to participate in a whole other kind of goal setting and intention, namely becoming aware of what trends were occurring and what seemed to be about to emerge in our so-called real world.
Yeah, well, for futurists, they're paying attention to a lot of this, and the medical world has studied, for example, prayer and its impact on healing, or meditation and its impact on healing. So we may not understand the specifics of it, but it seems like there's enough evidence to suggest that, it appears we do have some impact, literally, on the field, or on molecular structure, if we want to look at it that way. And so then the question is, a lot of times we get so wrapped up in the vision that we lose track of reality. And one of the things I know you and I have talked about is, and you did this actually with your friend that you talked about, standing upstream, as we call it, and really considering what are going to be the ripple effects and the impact of this vision or this goal that I'm setting and now engaging in carrying out. What are going to be the ripple effects, and am I aware of them as I go?
Well, and there's two parts to that. There's one part is the visions that we create consciously, the intentions.
Right.
I would like to have this happen. What are the implications? And assessing it and going upstream to look at the implications. That's one part of this. The other part is examining what we're already doing.
Right, yeah.
We're living in the midst of a field of intentions that we're unconscious of. I'm just thinking of an example. I know I've used this before, but the man who shows up at the therapist's office and he's complaining about his wife, and he says, man, she just blows up all the time. Everything I do, she just explodes. She's just got such a short fuse. I don't know what to do. Therapist listens to him for a while, his language especially. He says, I think I know your problem. You have your wife confused with a bomb.
Right, he was interacting with her as if she was some explosive device.
And he wasn't conscious he was doing that until the therapist alerted him to the fact that he had a program running that set his filters a certain way. He had a bias, and then he gathered evidence to prove that he was right, which resulted in a certain relationship with his wife.
Well, I think we've spent most of this program talking about the expansive nature of imagination. We touched a little bit on the limiting nature of imagination. That's probably worth another conversation at some point.
We can maybe return to that next week, because that's as big a topic as this one.
Yeah, I mean, how frequently, how often are we limiting our possibilities and limiting how we show up based on some kind of vision or imagining?
Yeah, like I could never do that.
Right.
Well, maybe really what's being said is I don't want to do that, or I don't believe in myself, because I might not have even tried.
Yeah.
So there's something very liberating here about understanding the power of the imagination, and I look forward to getting into that a little more.
Well, you can contact us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. Share with us your own experiences of imagination, and if you would like an opportunity to have a free pass to our module on creating stories to generate success, which kind of gets into some of the things we were talking about. Let us know that, and we'll send you a link that gives you a free pass to that module. You can play around with this whole idea of stories and imagination on your own. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Thanks for being with us, and we'll talk to you again next week.